Wow. Okay. That's good. Participants. I don't know what's going on. Let's try this one more time. Okay, we're still in live stream.
Okay.
Welcome to Psychology Social Hour. We're going to have Dr. Christine Ziemer present to us tonight from Missouri Western. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you that we're recording on Facebook and the session will be posted on our YouTube channel. Please have your video and audio off. You can type questions into the chat, either through Zoom or Facebook, and we'll take breaks and ask Dr. Zeeman, have a little Q&A. I'd like to read a disclaimer. This free virtual series features an educational program on a topic of mental health. This event is for generalized information and is no way a form of diagnosis. Please consult with your doctor or therapist for specific medical or psychological advice. We are merely starting the discussion to help destigmatize mental health. Mental illnesses, symptoms, diagnosis, and treatment methods are all a highly individualized process. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Ziemer. She is Associate Professor of Psychology at Missouri Western State University. She obtained her PhD in Developmental Science from the University of Iowa in 2012. Dr. Ziemer became interested in a vast array of conscious experiences while in graduate school and has carried that interest into her teaching career, where she now conducts courses in transpersonal psychology and psychedelic science. Welcome, Dr. Ziemer.
Hi, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And thanks to the museums for having me and having this talk today. All right, can you see that all right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I apologize, I am losing my voice a little bit, so hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I'm going to talk to you today about transpersonal psychology. And I teach a course in this at Missouri Western every fall semester. And if you've never heard the term transpersonal psychology before, the transpersonal term, we're going to get into what that means here in a minute. So just an outline of this talk. We're going to start by just welcoming you into this talk and what we're going to be sharing today, talking about some definitions, what the heck is transpersonal psychology, and the history of where this particular discipline of psychology, this brand of psychology comes from. We'll then get into sort of the substance of what these types of experiences are and the different varieties of transpersonal experiences, and then tie that into how these experiences relate to mental health. And end that with some nice integrating by coming back to some of the major themes of transpersonal psychology and some final concluding thoughts. So to start with, start with a quote from Joseph Campbell. What we are living is a fractional inkling of what is really within us, what gives us life, breadth, and depth. So transpersonal psychology is a holistic approach to wellness and mental health and well-being. So trying to move beyond just the, what we see on the surface and our kind of our daily interactions and going to that deeper meaning of life. So we'll start off with some preparation. And I like to start all of my classes in my transpersonal class with a little grounding and meditation. So from wherever you are listening to this now, if you would like to join me in just a little mindfulness moment, just go ahead and stretch your body or move in any way that you need to in order to feel comfortable. And then go ahead and sit or lie or however you're comfortable with your back relatively straight. And if you're in your feet flat on the ground, and if you feel good, go ahead and close your eyes in this space. And we're just going to take a few deep breaths. Breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth or through the nose, whichever is more comfortable. And while you're taking these breaths, your focus is just on the breath. So it's a practice of letting go of whatever else comes up in your mind, whatever's happened just before this, whatever might happen after this. It doesn't matter in this moment. Just focus on the breath. And as thoughts come up, it's okay. Don't let it be a frustration. Just acknowledge the thought and let it go. You can start to become aware of any sensations that you're feeling from outside your body or inside your body. If there's any discomfort or unease in your body, just be aware of it. Any sensations such as the temperature of the air in the room, any sounds you might hear or smells you might smell, just noticing them. In this practice, we're just fully inhabiting this moment of our life and giving recognition to the fact that we so seldom stop and pause and just feel into our body and our senses and our breath. And hopefully you feel a sense of peace and tranquility when you do that. We'll take a few more deep breaths, giving yourself some gratitude for being here today and learning something new together. And when you're ready, you can slowly open your eyes, maybe do some gentle movement to come back into the space, ready to focus and hear more. So you may be familiar with mindfulness practice. It's definitely becoming something that is becoming more popular. And we're hearing about it more, both in mental health and outside of there. Move my little screen here. And that is, one aspect of this transpersonal psychology that I'm going to be talking about today. So what does transpersonal mean? Let's actually break down the word. So the prefix of trans means to bridge, to go beyond or across a concept. In personal, we're talking about the sense of self or ego. So in transpersonal, we're talking about experiences that go beyond that default sense of self or our default sense of identity and ego that we experience. So these can be, altered states of consciousness. They can be out of body experiences, and they can be experiences like what we just did of mindfulness and embodiment. So psychology, as you may know, is a scientific study of the brain and behavior. So there's a little bit of a disconnect here because we're talking about some really kind of out there spiritual, out of body, really personal experiences. And then we're trying to look at it through the scientific lens of psychology. And so that's a little bit of the friction that we have on this topic, is that the tools of science sometimes fall a little short to really look at these aspects of human existence that are more in the spiritual realm. So sometimes, since the term transpersonal is less familiar, we will call this class transpersonal spiritual psychology. So how do we scientifically study the spirit? That's the interesting question that we're exploring. So focusing on the human potential to go beyond the ego, go beyond that normal sense of self, and achieve higher states of consciousness. So, altered states of consciousness that are not just like inebriation, but states of consciousness that have benefit to us, like being mindful and embodied. states of consciousness that have potential for healing specifically. So to break down the scientific study of transpersonal psychology, we're talking about experiences that are beyond the self, that are integrative or holistic, and that have the potential to be transformational. So with out-of-body experiences, they can be transcendent. They can alter our brain functioning from its normal default. And they can be, you can reach these states through both intentional practices like breath work and meditation. They can also occur naturally, like when you look up at the night sky and you're just sort of like awed by the immensity of space and how small you feel. These experiences are what we call or integrative, in that they're engaging the whole body. They're recognizing a connection between the way we feel mentally with the way we feel physically, and also the state of our environment, our ecosystem, and our social ecosystem, and our spiritual well-being. And finally, they have this wonderful potential for transformation, for positive growth and healing, what Maslow would call self-actualization, and just basically a more joyful, peaceful life, living more compassionately. So William James is often called the father of modern day psychology. He wrote the first psychology textbook in the late 1800s. And right around that same time, he also wrote a textbook on the varieties of religious experience. He's actually the first academic to use the term transpersonal psychology. And he was really interested in the spiritual side of human nature. So here's one quote from his text in 1902. Our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one consciousness, whilst all about it, painted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. So he was really interested in exploring these different realms of consciousness. And he did his own experiments in consciousness, various methods, including using nitrous oxide to alter his consciousness and explore what these different states or these so-called mystical experiences were like. So William James defined mystical experiences in his text with four main qualities. One is that they're ineffable, which means you can't put them into words easily. They defy expression. They're a state of feeling or emotion, and difficult to quantify with words. They're noetic, so they carry a sense of authority, as in they feel more real than real life. And that sort of very strong sense of knowing that is difficult to put into words. They're transient. You don't stay in these states. They come and go, oftentimes without our ability to control them. And they're a lot of times that passive, unable to come without our conscious control. Arguably we can cultivate states for these, such as a mindfulness practice or breath work or yoga practice. A lot of times those elusive states where you do have this kind of deep spiritual revelation or connection or feeling, those, even with a cultivated practice, are sometimes just come upon us unexpected. The sun is setting. I'm going to turn on a light here. So just a second. Give myself a little more light back here. There. Okay, so Abraham Maslow is another famous psychologist in the early days of psychology and moving into the more humanistic focus of psychology. So he's famous for the hierarchy of needs, which you may be familiar with if you've studied some psychology at all. And the hierarchy of needs is basically saying we need certain things met, certain needs met before we can reach or even attempt to move towards higher needs. So for example, if you're hungry, if you're sleep deprived, you're thirsty, that's going to be your main focus. And it's going to be really hard for you to work on, feelings of self-esteem because you're just working at that survival instinct. So things like physical safety and our biological needs are at the base of the pyramid. After that, we do have a really strong sense to socially belong, to feel like we're part of a group, to feel loved, to form intimate relationships and friendships. Above that, we want to feel good about ourselves and have a sense of accomplishment. If all of those needs are met, then we can work on fulfilling our quote, full potential, which was called self-actualization. And a lot of times in intrapsych, that's kind of where the pyramid ends. But later in his life, as Maslow was reflecting on these needs, he added another top on the pyramid, which he called self-transcendence, which is, even if we're living to our full potential, even if we are, you know, quote unquote successful, and we've made lots of money, and we have all of these you know, things that we could ever want, and we have a family that loves us, sometimes we still suffer from depression or a you know, existential crisis, or just kind of feeling uneasy or wondering what it's all about. So a sense of meaning in our life is also really important. And as you can see, being at the top of the pyramid, it's one of those things that you have to a lot of times have a lot of your more basic needs, you know, feel safe and feel belonging and feel good about yourself before you can really reach these levels of transcendence. But, you know, to take that with a grain of salt too, because we can always be working on different levels simultaneously as well. So even if you don't feel like your self-esteem is that great, you can still work on these levels of self-actualization and self-transcendence. So it's not, you know, really all or nothing, black or white sort of deal. So we see evidence of transpersonal psychology in the early days of psychology with William James and Maslow and the humanistic movement, moving into the transpersonal movement. But it really, these ideas go much further back than Western psychology, which is only, you know, 150 years old or so. We see evidence of people using these types of holistic approaches to commune with spirit and use different technologies to form communal ties and healing. So things like using plant medicines such as fungi, mushrooms, and plants and wines. We see evidence of that back to some of the earliest prehistoric cave drawings. We know of traditions of shamanism coming out of Russia and all over the world, where they had spiritual leaders in the communities who would be called upon in times of crisis of the community, spiritual crisis or physical crisis, and they would commune with the spirit realm and bring back information. Practices in ancient Greece and other early religions had rituals that, you know, involved things like festivals of revelry, where different things were ingested and people would dance and drum. You know, Eastern traditions of meditation and mindfulness and commune with spirit worlds that we hear of in early religious texts as well. So this idea that humans are spiritual beings and have a craving for that type of connection to something bigger than themselves is not a new idea, even though the field of transpersonal psychology is relatively new as a scientific field. These ideas are really pretty ancient. So let's get into what we're talking about when we're talking about the types of experiences that this encompasses. So I love this quote: "There's many paths to the top of the mountain, but the view is always the same." So this is a proverb that kind of gets to the meat of this, that although there's lots of different methods for reaching these different transpersonal states, some may work better for one person versus another, or at one time versus another, but they're all having a very similar goal, which is to step outside this default ego self, connect with something bigger and more meaningful. Maybe that's the earth, the planet, the universe, maybe that's the community, or maybe that's some spiritual meaning. So I'm going to go through each of these briefly on the next slides. But these are some of the categories that we talk about in the class for different ways that humans have found to create or find these mystical altered states. So let's start with the first one, entheogens. If you're not familiar with that word, it's in some ways a synonym for psychedelics, but it's a word that means a substance that helps you connect to the divine within or find the God within yourself. So some people like to use the term entheogen instead of psychedelic, which means mind manifesting, specifically when these substances are being used for a spiritual practice. For example, the Native American Church has for a long time used peyote as part of a spiritual practice to commune with the divine and to engender a sense of community. And like we saw with the prehistoric cave drawings and history of plant medicines, these have been used across the globe as far back as we have basically human evidence of human existence. So there's been a real strong resurgence on plant medicines and psychedelics recently, specifically in mental health. And that was what my talk last year for the museums was about. The idea that if we want to create a mystical experience, there are lots of paths, but this is potentially a very powerful shortcut to get there. Because even if you don't have a mindfulness meditation practice or have never done breath work, they've been able to give people a capsule of psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, and reliably have somebody have a very meaningful mystical experience, to the point where they will list that experience in the research lab with this capsule of psilocybin as one of the most meaningful experiences in their entire life, ranked up there with childbirth or death of a parent. So they're very powerful, and it's not anything new. Like we said, ancient shamanic and indigenous cultures have used entheogen for generations. But modern science is starting to really examine how these substances work and using that as a window into consciousness itself. So some of these other methods, such as breath work or yoga or meditation or dance or art, may be tapping into some of these similar realms. But since we can scientifically produce reliably these types of experiences, we can also do things like have people take psilocybin and then look at their brain activity in an MRI scan or ERP, and be able to tell or make some inferences and assumptions about how consciousness is changed in these altered states. We also have naturally occurring transpersonal experiences, obviously a lot more difficult to control when that will happen. There's a lot of argument that our birth is a transpersonal experience. If you think about what the experience of being born is like, we don't remember it necessarily consciously, but we're moving from one world to another, right? We're breathing air for the first time, we're seeing for the first time. And we know from the study of neuroscience that there's a lot of really interesting, a cocktail of hormones and neurotransmitters being released in the brain of the birthing mother and the infant, as well as to some extent to other people in the room, such as the other parent. So that might be, in itself a very out of the normal sense of ego experience that we all go through. And similarly, death as another big transitional point. I like to bring into our class a birth and death doula, people who have had a lot of experience around birth and around death, and to talk about the similarities of those two experiences and how they are, overwhelmingly kind of medicalized and not talked about and taboo in our society, but they're two very powerful experiences that we in our human life are guaranteed. So it's really interesting that we don't talk about them that much. We can also have naturally occurring experiences through our dreams. That's one that we probably have a lot of access, more frequent access to. And so the practice of dream journaling and remembering your dreams, and even practicing lucid dreaming, being able to have some awareness that you're dreaming while in the dream state and being able to then maybe control some elements of the dream. Those are all considered transpersonal experiences as well. Of course, we have intentional practices, things that we might be more familiar with, like meditation. And there's lots of different forms of meditation: mindfulness meditation, loving kindness, visualizations. We can also change our consciousness through our breath. So the way that we're breathing, whether we're having an extended exhale or an extended inhale, or we're holding our breath for longer periods, or we're breathing rapidly for long periods, can shift our brain behavior and shift our consciousness. Movement practices such as yoga and Tai Chi similarly are connecting through the body and through movement to quiet the mind and really give you that sense of presence in a similar way to meditation. And then you can also change your consciousness through things like fasting, saunas or ice baths, kind of the extreme temperatures, and sensory deprivation. So there's sensory deprivation tanks that people will go into where you're floating in salt water that's the same temperature, very similar temperature to your body. And then they close the lids, a very soundproof, light-proof, dark environment. So it's trying to eliminate your sensory information so that you are really it's just your mind floating there, sort of disconnected from the body. That's another way to alter your consciousness in different ways. So we can also alter our consciousness through movement, through embodied ecstasy. Another window of transpersonal states that a lot of us may have access to more regularly is sex. Orgasms can be a transpersonal experience. Again, we've got a cocktail of oxytocin and these wonderful hormones being released in our brains during that type of activity. And that can be, with a partner or by yourself. And there's lots of different ways to access these altered states, bodies, through dancing, moving in rhythm and by yourself or in community, moving your bodies in ways that feel good and joyful and fun. And other types of movement practices can also shift us into a really present, really embodied state of consciousness. And they can create a lot of joy and healing as well. We can find transpersonal experiences through connecting with nature, whether that's, spending a pet or some plants, taking care of animals and plants, or going out into a beautiful nature scene and being immersed in that, forest bathing, taking a walk in the woods, looking up at the night sky or out at the ocean, or standing here in Missouri out on the edge of the bluffs and looking at the long expanse of land. Sometimes when we have those experiences, we may naturally feel a sense of awe or wonder, or we may feel really, really small in compared to the vastness of the universe. One powerful, the overview effect, it's starting to be looked at with people who actually go out into space and are able to see the whole Earth from the distance point of a spaceship or out in space. And how that can really change your perspective on life, right? And how connected we are and how fragile our world is. So we can have these types of experiences that are beyond the ego normal default sense of self through connecting with nature as well. And then also through the arts. If you've ever reached what's called a flow state, if you're creating art or music, or you're doing something physical with your body, like athletics or sports, sometimes you may reach a state where you feel like it's becoming effortless, like you're channeling something, like you're really in the zone, or something else over, and it's just automatic. These are wonderful feelings that people in music and art and sports often strive for. Sometimes they're really difficult to predict when they're going to happen and what the exact state is that create them. But these are also being studied and looked at as transpersonal states of consciousness. So these are just a few pictures from the class that I teach. I try to give the students as much experience with these different states of consciousness as I can. Obviously, we're not taking psychedelics, but we go out and walk in nature. I have a yoga instructor from here in town come and lead a yoga class. We have a breathwork instructor come and lead us through different ways of breathing to alter consciousness. Like I said, we talk with birth and death doulas, and we have an ecstatic dance demo. Here is us doing a drum circle with the percussion department. So, drumming is one way that Indigenous tribes use to create a sense of community and a sense of or altered consciousness through prolonged sessions of drumming and dancing. So we're able to, get little tastes of things we might want to explore deeper on our own through having these experiences in the class. So how do we connect these experiences now to mental health? Because that's why we're here, right? We want to understand, yes, how do we have meaning, but then how does that connect back to this major problem we have of mental health here in this country, in the world? So this is a stats from the National Academy of Mental Illness, where in the United States alone, 1 in 5 adults have some sort of diagnosed mental illness, 21% of the population. So it's extremely common. I don't think that this is any big news to anybody, that this is a really a big problem, emerging issue that is just continuing to get worse. If we look specifically at depression and anxiety, in America alone, that's 16 million people with depression, 42 million with anxiety. And we all know that the pandemic has exacerbated, maybe made some of this worse in some ways, and also brought it a lot to the surface, which in a way is good because we're having more conversations about it. We're recognizing that it's an issue and starting to explore possibilities for healing. So one take on depression is that these are ruminations. When we're feeling depressed or we're feeling anxious, we're getting stuck in ruminating about regrets of the past, with depression and sort of feelings of low self-esteem, past feelings, or in the case of anxiety, fears about the future. So the common thing here with both of these is that we're not in the present moment. And if we can find more instances of being mindful and tuning into the present moment, we can step out of these ruminating thought cycles that we get stuck in of the past and of the future. So mindfulness has really been gaining a lot of momentum in mental health for treatment of depression and anxiety. And that, through this practice, you are training your brain to let go of those cycles of thought. And like any muscle, you need to keep practicing to grow that ability to do that, to let go of those thoughts as they come up. For example, if you're having trouble sleeping because of anxiety and you keep thinking about all these things you have to do, having a practice of mindfulness where you can say, okay, I acknowledge these thoughts. It's not that they're, not real, but at this moment, I'm going to just be present and I'm going to not worry about that right now. I'm going to let that go. To be able to relax your body and to be able to sleep, which we know, being able to do that also is going to correlate with better physical health, because you're not in that fight or flight response and you're able to relax and repair and regenerate. So mindfulness and the fact these experiences in a lot of ways really bring about that sense of presence and mindfulness, whether it's meditation, going out and spending time with nature, or doing movement practices. And the other cool thing about these experiences that we're learning from psychedelics is that they increase what's called our neuroplasticity, which is our brain's ability to form new connections and to change and to grow. So that's really helpful too for dealing with mental illness, where we seem to be stuck in these patterns and we want to create a new, healthier way of functioning with the brain. So psychedelics definitely increase neuroplasticity, and that's why they're starting to be looked at and used in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. You can today go out and get psychedelic assisted psychotherapy with ketamine. And then in some states like Oregon, they're starting to introduce other types of substances as well. So it'll be an interesting future for that. But we also see increased neuroplasticity with, increased practices that, include mindfulness and that presence. So these techniques of transpersonal are starting to be applied more in therapy. So what transpersonal therapy includes is, again, an integration of all of the parts of our humanity. So looking at our spiritual well-being, as well as our social, emotional, intellectual, physical, creative self. In modern psychology, we often talk about a biopsychosocial approach. Those three things: our biology, our psychology, and our social environment. What transpersonal adds in is the spiritual side. So it's a biopsychosocial spiritual approach, understanding that we as humans, in order to live a joyful, fulfilled life, also really crave a deeper sense of connection and meaning. And that doesn't have to be a religious meaning, although sometimes it is. It can also be a sense of connection to the environment, connection to our community. Using in transpersonal therapy, Eastern spiritual traditions such as mindfulness, such as yoga, leaning into all of this ancient wisdom that has been used across the world in different ways for so long. There's a focus on processing trauma, on really looking at the source of, which a lot of times there's a root of trauma, whether we're talking about depression, anxiety, addiction. And instead of just trying to treat the symptoms, going to the root cause of the mental illness and trying to process the trauma, experience it, re-experience it in a way that you can kind of remap it in your brain and learn to move past wherever that stuckness is. And using these different states of consciousness as a catalyst for positive growth and human potential. So some of the ways that this is done is through practices of movement. Hakomi and Rolfing are two ways of using movement within the therapy model. So touch and movement in specific ways of the body and elicit different release of held up tension or emotion. DR, which is eye movement desensitization, and sorry, I'm forgetting the word for a second, desensitization and reprocessing. There, I left myself a note in case I forgot. And this is a really interesting one, sort of in the state of hypnosis where you kind of look back and forth. But realizing that the moving your eyes back and forth can sometimes put people into a trance-like state and also help them reprocess trauma. So using eye movements, or it's then moved on to, left, right clickers or left, right tapping, that's integrating the left and right hemisphere, allowing people to go back into the emotions of a trauma and remap that. It's like yoga, dance, Tai Chi, even improv theater. So improv games or acting out some of the emotions that people are feeling can be used as these holistic approaches. Psychoanalytic techniques, so really digging into the mind and how earlier behaviors and experiences shape our later experience of life and mental health. So looking at the psyche as an integrated system, it's called integrated family system. So you're doing basically family therapy, but just for one person, for all of the different parts that we have inside of us. Recognizing that we all have, we're familiar with an inner child, but then maybe some other protectors or guardians of that inner child emerged based on some early trauma that we experienced. And so addressing these different parts of ourselves that have emerged in order to protect us or help us survive or help us get where we want to be, and trying to find harmony within those different parts. Even things like looking at birth trauma or past life or ancestral trauma that's being handed down or experienced, and using a lot of guided imagery in those types of meditations or psychedelic experiences. And inducing mystical states to access these other realms too. So things like hypnosis, but meditation, breath work. And this picture here shows what psychedelic assisted psychotherapy looks like in the clinical trials. So it's more of the person going inward than the therapist really guiding so much. The therapists are there to support as the client themselves is doing the inner work. And there's a lot of emphasis with this practice of transpersonal therapy on the inner healer, the idea that the body has a natural tendency towards healing, the same if we get physically sick or we get physically injured. If the conditions are right, we have rest and we're eating well and taking care of ourselves, that the body will naturally start to heal. The cut will naturally scab over. The virus will eventually work its way through and out. And same way with our mental illness, that we have a tendency towards health, but there's a lot of systemic issues in our environment and trauma that are preventing us from reaching that. So removing the barriers to mental health and allowing the inner healer to do what it does naturally. So this is just a graphic showing the paradigm shift that we're moving towards with transpersonal psychology and psychedelic assisted therapy. So instead of thinking about people having brain dysfunctions, right? That's kind of the paradigm that we're in now, that you don't have enough serotonin or dopamine, or there's something that's not firing right in your brain as our explanation. Moving more towards a mental injury, that yes, there's something wrong, but it can be healed potentially, right? So shifting the explanation from there's something wrong with you to there's something that's injured, and how can we create an environment for that to heal? That then changes our diagnostics. So instead of these discrete categorical disorders that we see in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, and treat this thing this way and this other thing that way, we can look at treatment as more of a multidimensional spectrum and more holistic approach. That the same way that we're treating trauma for PTSD might also treat trauma for depression or addiction or anxiety or eating disorders. And when we start to see the underlying causes, it changes the way that we're going to treat these mental injuries. So instead of a specific drug for a specific disorder, we are focusing more on holistic treatments. And sometimes a drug may be a part of that. Absolutely. Sometimes that can be really helpful. But to look at what are the larger scale environmental, social environments that people are living in, and how can we also make those more healing to create mental health. So just to wrap up some of the majors that come up with this topic and some final thoughts on where this field is going. Themes that come up over teaching this class. One of them is, like I mentioned in the beginning, this dichotomy of spiritual and science and spirit. We tend to think of science as really objective and really measurable. And I think that's why the field of psychology, even though William James, the father of psychology, was interested in this stuff, the field of psychology by and large has not dealt with the spiritual realm, right? We're really focused on the beings that we can observe and measure. And these spiritual experiences are really hard to observe and measure. But that doesn't mean that they are not things that exist and have maybe a lot of really great potential for healing. So just because we can't study it with the scientific tools that we have today doesn't mean that it's not important and meaningful. And maybe we need to shift science to be more inclusive of other types of experiences. So it's an ongoing question and debate and challenge for the field of transpersonal psychology. The idea of child mind or beginner mind. Beginner mind is a concept in Buddhism and oftentimes in meditation, that we want to approach things from curiosity, not from a point where, oh, I know all this, but I'm really interested. I want to know more, and starting sort of with a vessel. And children naturally come at the world from this way. Children also naturally are able to slip into transpersonal states much more easier. They tend to naturally have a sense of wonder and awe and joy. And so I think part of what we're searching for as adults is to recapture that joy and that curiosity and that awe of the world. And so that's another theme that comes up a lot. This idea of what is mental illness, what is madness, and what's the line between, having a really profound spiritual experience, even hallucination, which, you see common in things like schizophrenia, but you also see common in, the shamanic traditions. And so sort of depending on the culture and the time period and the context, what might be considered madness in one context might be considered, a divine connection in another. It's another concept that, there's a lot to unpack there. Finding this deeper, either through connecting with our bodies, through embodiment, through dance, through sex, through movement, through sports, or disconnecting with our bodies in the sense of sensory deprivation, or, you know, the extreme temperatures and it's like states that we can reach. So there seems to be kind of different pathways to the top of the mountain. Some go from within the physical body and some from beyond. A common theme of surrendering. And in order to surrender to the experience, to the flow, needing to feel really safe, really grounded, and a sense of connection. So in that picture of the psychedelic assisted therapy, the person was laying comfortably. They had a blanket on them. They were holding the hand of the guide. So all of these things that are going to cue you into that you are safe, you're protected, you're grounded, so that you can then have this experience where you're perhaps leaving your body and entering a world of the ineffable and noetic. And finally, this goal of living with joy and reaching some of that joy through playfulness. Practices like ecstatic dance encourage us to move our bodies in joyful, playful ways, and to forget all of this social conditioning that tells you that, you know, if you move this way, people are going to think you're being weird or sexual or think you're crazy, right? So turning off all of that social conditioning and just playing like a child would play. And the more that we can find experiences that bring us that playfulness, the more that we can cultivate joy. And that's, you know, definitely a goal I think that a lot of us have, to live a joyful life. So these are just a few quotes that I really think put it into context. This idea of moving beyond just treating the symptoms and medicating to looking at more holistic approaches that may include medicine, but also include a lot more of the broader ecosystem. So the current dominant paradigm of diagnosing and treating mental disorders is limited for the most part. In view of transpersonal psychology's challenges to the notion of individuals as separate from their context, see most mental disorders as a problem within the individual denies the context. So moving beyond just this is your problem to let's look at the full context that is creating this problem. So things like poverty, war, family strife, superficial culture emphasizing materialism over deeper values, many more contexts can be seen as causes of many but not all mental disorders. It's observed to diagnose hungry, unloved children, untreated dental problems, who live in untenable environments replete with drive-by shootings as being mentally ill, and giving them traditional psychological treatments or psychotropic drugs. So again, not to deny some people have biological issues for which these drugs can help, especially in short-term situations, while more lasting situations are found. But in essence, I think we have a broken mental health system due to embracing fundamental assumptions that are invalid. So this may feel a little like passing the buck that we say, the problem is mental health. That's what people are saying whenever we have, incidents of violence. The problem is mental health. And yes, absolutely, there's a mental health crisis. But then for mental health to turn around and say, well, the problem is poverty and systemic racism and materialism and consumerism and patriarchy and all the different things that you might point to that are causing people to feel oppressed and not feel safe and not be able to live joyful lives. So yes, there definitely needs to be a lot of focus on mental health, but we also need to look at the broader picture and the environments, the ecosystem, and the holistic values here. So just to wrap up, coming back to our definition of transpersonal psychology as these two definitions, as a bridge to connect and as a way to have positive growth, holistic healing, and transformation. So what are we bridging? We're bridging the connection that maybe has been lost between ourselves and our own bodies, between ourselves and the community. Just a minute. Ourselves and the planet and nature, and ourselves and the collective conscious, the cosmos. And maybe, in fact, this is a bridge between the scientific and the spiritual realms. And as far as what we're transforming through this practice, we can transform ourselves. We can transform our communities, our planet, and hopefully positively transform the field of psychology and address the crisis of mental health. So finally, I'll leave you with this. I don't believe people are looking for meaning in life as much as they're looking for the experience of being alive. And I really think at the core, that's what all these experiences are tapping into. starting out with our meditation and inhabiting this moment, and how often do we really just take the time to fully inhabit and feel into the moment? How often do we have the experience of being alive? And maybe that's what we're all searching for. So that's it. Thank you. There's lots of ways you can connect with me, my email, or you can find me on Facebook. And thank you to St. Joseph Museums and for Missouri Western State University, where I work, for encouraging me and supporting me in teaching on these topics.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Seaman. It was a fascinating presentation. Could you leave us maybe with some additional resources if somebody wanted to do some more further investigation into this?
Yeah, well, I would say whichever of these practices you found most interesting, to dive in and explore those practices. So there are, a little bit in St. Joe, but especially in Kansas City, there's a lot of different groups doing things like ecstatic dance. There's yoga and breath groups here in town. Depending on what it is that they're interested in exploring. Just a minute, I'm almost done. You can kind of dive into that and read about it, or go find those experiences yourself. If you're really interested in sort of academic reading on transpersonal psychology, Stanislav Grof is a really good place to start. He's sometimes called the father of transpersonal psychology, and he has written a lot about the different transpersonal states, and has a lot of great resources through his literature and films and that sort of thing.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Well, hopefully we'll have many views of this presentation, although it was just you and I on the Zoom tonight.
Yeah, that's all right. I'm happy to share. So hopefully you enjoyed it.